April the 26th, 1986, a date that will forever alter the course of history. At 1:23 a.m, Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a routine safety test, unleashing a catastrophic series of events. The disaster at Chernobyl exposed the vulnerabilities in both technology and governance, leading to a tragedy that would ripple across the world and ultimately lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Chernobylite, a game set in the shadow of Chernobyl, brings us face to face with this haunting reality. It recreates the exclusion zone with painstaking detail, allowing us to explore the very place where one of the worst nuclear disasters in history began. But to understand what happened here, we must look beyond the ruined landscape and delve into the complex web of causes that led to the explosion. In the decades leading up to the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet Union invested heavily in nuclear power as a cornerstone of its industrial and military strategies. The RBMK reactor used at Chernobyl was one of the most prominent designs, and it was chosen for its ability to produce both electricity and weapons-grade plutonium, a dual-use technology that aligned with the Soviet Union's policies. However, the RBMK reactor had several critical design flaws that made it inherently unstable, especially under certain operating conditions. Unlike most reactors, which use water both as a coolant and a moderator, the RBMK used graphite as a moderator and water as coolant. This design allowed for larger reactors, but it also introduced dangerous vulnerabilities. One of our most significant flaws was the reactor's positive void coefficient. In simple terms, this meant that if the coolant water in the reactor started to boil away, the reactor would become more reactive rather than less. This feedback loop could and eventually did lead to a rapid, uncontrollable power increase. Additionally, the control rods designed to slow down the reaction were tipped with graphite. When inserted into the reactor, these rods initially displaced the coolant water, momentarily increasing reactivity before slowing it down. This design flaw would prove catastrophic in 1986. On the night of April 25th, the operators at Chernobyl began a routine test to simulate a power outage. The goal was to determine if the remaining energy in the reactor could generate enough electricity to power the cooling pumps until backup generators came online. But what began as a routine procedure quickly spiraled out of control. The test was delayed for several hours, and when it finally began, the reactor was in an unstable condition due to a combination of inexperience, poor communication, and pressure to complete the test. The operators made a series of critical errors. They disabled key safety systems and allowed the reactor's power level to drop dangerously low. In an attempt to stabilize the reactor, they reinserted the control rods, unaware that the graphite tips would cause a sudden spike in reactivity. At 1:23 a.m, the reactor's power surged to more than 100 times its normal output. Within seconds, a massive steam explosion occurred, blowing the 1,000-ton roof off of the reactor building. A second explosion followed, rupturing the reactor core and releasing a deadly cloud of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Mixing historical reality with science fiction, we navigate the ruins of Sector 4. We are reminded of the immense power that was unleashed here, power that was ultimately beyond our control. In the immediate aftermath, the first to respond were the firefighters from Pripyat, who were called to extinguish the fires raging across reactor buildings. Unaware of the radiation exposure they were suffering, these brave men fought the blaze for hours. Among them was Lieutenant Vasily Ignatenko, who later succumbed to acute radiation sickness. Their courage prevented the fire from spreading to other reactors, but it came at a terrible cost. In the hours and days that followed, the Soviet government attempted to downplay the severity of the disaster.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died. The Soviets may have been fairly quick to acknowledge the accident because evidence in the form of mild nuclear radiation had already reached beyond the Soviet borders to Scandinavia.
Despite knowing the true extent of the damage, officials delayed the evacuation of Pripyat for 36 hours. During this time, residents went about their daily lives, completely unaware that they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. It wasn't until radiation alarms were triggered in Sweden nearly 2 days later that the world would begin to realise the scale of the catastrophe. Pripyat, once a thriving city, was evacuated in haste. People were told that they would return in a few days, but they never did. Chernobylite captures this aftermath, where time seems to stand still in a city that was once full of life. Today, it is a ghost town frozen in a moment in which the city was abandoned. To prevent further catastrophe, the Soviet Union mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers, miners, and engineers. These people were known as liquidators. They were sent to Chernobyl to contain the spread of radioactive contamination. These men and women performed some of the most dangerous work in history, from cleaning radioactive debris to constructing the sarcophagus over Reactor 4. Their efforts, however heroic, came with great sacrifice, as many would later suffer from radiation-related illness and death. Scientists played a crucial role in the aftermath of the disaster, not only in studying the immediate impact, but in our understanding of radiation's long-term effects. Figures like Valery Legasov, the chief scientist on the government commission investigating the disaster, were instrumental in uncovering the truth. Legasov, who later committed suicide, left behind tapes detailing the cover-up and the negligence that had led to the disaster. His revelations exposed the systemic flaws in the Soviet system and contributed to the eventual collapse of the USSR. An event occurred of such a scale, of such involvement of people with controversial interests, of errors and victories, failures and successes. There are so many different interpretations of how and why this happened, that it is, in a way, my duty to tell what I know, how I see and understand it, and how I witnessed the events that occurred. The Chernobyl disaster was a significant factor in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. It exposed deep-seated corruption, incompetence, and disregard for human life within the system. The disaster also fueled growing unrest among the Soviet populace. As truth about Chernobyl began to emerge, environmentally, the exclusion zone became one of the most radioactive places on the planet, with consequences that are still being studied today. Yet, ironically, this area has become a unique ecological reserve where nature has begun to reclaim the land. In Chernobylite, the exclusion zone is not just a setting. It's a living, breathing entity filled with threats and mysterious forces. As we navigate it, we're constantly reminded of the dangers that still linger in the area, even decades after the disaster. The game's portrayal of the zone is both a tribute to the real-world site and a chilling reimagining of what could lie beneath the surface. In Chernobylite, you play as Igor, a former physicist who worked at Chernobyl before the disaster. Years after the meltdown, Igor returns to the exclusion zone, not just to explore the mysteries that linger, but search for his fiancée Tatiana, who disappeared during the evacuation. The impact of the Chernobyl disaster was felt far, far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. Radioactive fallout spread across Europe, contaminating land and water for thousands of miles. The exclusion zone has become a unique, eerie ecosystem where nature has reclaimed land, yet it is also a place where the consequences of human error are still visible. Scientists continue to study the long-term effects of radiation on the environment, even as new structures like the new safe confinement are built to contain the remnants of Reactor 4. Chernobylite takes us inside the sarcophagus itself, a place where reality and nightmare intertwine. In this space, we confront the lingering presence of Chernobyl's deadly legacy and of those who gave their lives to contain it. The game blurs the line between history and fiction, allowing us to explore a place that few have ever seen. The Pripyat amusement park was meant to be a symbol of joy and leisure, set to open on May the 1st, 1986 for the May Day celebrations. Instead, it became a symbol of the abrupt end of life as it was known. In Chernobyl, the park is a reminder of the vibrant community that once existed, now forever frozen in time. The legacy of Chernobyl is one of both tragedy and triumph. The disaster exposed flaws in human technology and governance, but also led to a greater understanding of the dangers of nuclear power and the need for cooperation in managing these risks. Chernobylite captures the essence of this legacy, blending historical reality with science fiction to create an experience that is as thought-provoking as it is haunting. As we leave the exclusion zone in both the game and the past, we carry with us the lessons of Chernobyl, a reminder of the thin line between human ingenuity and catastrophe. The story of Chernobyl is far from over, and its impact will be felt for generations to come.